In his book, Following Jesus Without Embarrassing God, Tony Campolo tells a story about Randy Johnson. Not Randy Johnson, the Hall of Fame pitcher, but Randy Johnson, President Lyndon Johnson's nephew. This Randy was the third-string quarterback on the Oklahoma State football team. Nobody would have paid any attention to him if he hadn't been LBJ's nephew. Well, it was 1966, and Oklahoma State was close to finishing another poor season, except for their final game against their arch rival, Oklahoma. They were in the top 10 and were expected to go to a bowl game. Now, Oklahoma was the heavy favorite in this game, but you know how it is with rivalry games. Anything's possible. And it was a close game right down to the end. With 8 seconds left, Oklahoma State was only behind by 6 points. It was raining hard, but they were still 80 yards from the end zone. So OSU's coach called timeout, and he sent in all of his seniors so that they could finish the game on the field. He said to Randy Johnson, who was now in as the quarterback, "Call any play you want. The game's over." When they came out of the huddle, the coach couldn't believe his eyes. You see, they had lined up for play 13. And play 13 was a trick play that they had never actually used in a game because they had never actually successfully completed it in practice. But they ran play 13, and wouldn't you know, it worked. They went 80 yards down in one play and kicked the extra point with no time left to win the game. And Oklahoma State fans came pouring onto the field as their coach simply stood by in disbelief. In the locker room, he asked Randy, "Why? Why did you call play 13? And Randy said, "Well, Coach, we got into the huddle, and I looked at old Bill, and there he was, injured for 2 years and never getting to play much, and now it was all over, and there were tears running down his face. And there I looked at his jersey, and it said 8. And then I looked around, and there was George, and he had come to practice and worked hard for 4 straight years and only got to play a couple of times. And now it was over for him, too, and there were tears running down his face. And I looked, and his number was 7. So I added 8 and 7 and got 13. So I called play 13, Coach." The coach, he just stared at Randy a minute and said, "But Randy, 8 plus 7 isn't 13, it's 15. Randy thought for a moment, and he said, "Well, Coach, if I'd been as smart as you, we wouldn't have won the game." Tony Campolo concluded that story this way. He said, "Sometimes the correct answer is not the right answer." When I read in John about this conversation between Nicodemus and Jesus, I sometimes feel like I'm listening to Randy Johnson and his coach discuss play 13. Nicodemus, you see, he's looking for the correct answer, but Jesus is trying to give him the right answer. And poor old Nick just can't make sense of all the math. He, like many others, is looking for correct answers to life's many questions. I'm guessing he would prefer something along the lines of a spiritual self-help book. You know, something like 10 things you can do to guarantee your place in God's kingdom. Or get closer to God the rabbi way, 4 weeks to a holier you. Instead, he gets riddles from Jesus along the lines of 8 plus 7 equals 13. You must be born again, Jesus says. You must be born of water and the Spirit. Either way, what Jesus says doesn't make much sense. How can one crawl back into his mother's womb after he's grown old? Like Campolo said, sometimes the correct answer isn't the right one. Just like Nicodemus, we are looking for correct answers, proper answers, appropriate and sensible answers to life's questions. We want things to be logical. We want them to make sense, or at least we want them to be entertaining. And then we hear of Jesus talking about being born from above and the Son of Man being lifted up like Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, and it's all enough to make your head spin. But again, sometimes the correct answer isn't the right one. When we meet Nicodemus again, a few chapters later in John's Gospel, we find him still struggling to make sense of what Jesus is saying. When his fellow leaders demand that Jesus be arrested and silenced in John chapter 7, Nicodemus advocates giving Jesus a fair hearing first, without mentioning that, of course, he had already met with Jesus. And when Jesus is finally arrested and executed, we hear nothing from Nicodemus at all. When Jesus was raised up on the cross, he gave up his spirit, John says. And when he was pierced with the spear, water flowed from his lifeless side. Only then, after Jesus is taken off the cross, does Nicodemus come again to visit Jesus. Only then does he understand that he must bury the one who gave himself up, that Nicodemus and all who believe might be reborn. Every day, we live somewhere in between. Somewhere in between knowing that we're children of God through water and the Spirit and understanding what that means for daily life. Like Abram, we live somewhere in between staying home and going where God is sending us. Between believing on one hand that God has more for us and believing on the other that this is all there is. Our lives are filled with such fear and suspense and longing because we live in between. And in that place of living in between, this is where God's grace rains down on our lives. As Nicodemus sat there listening to Jesus, Jesus said that God has invested the life of his Son into each of us. And that has a way of putting everything in perspective. God's love becomes a holy mystery for us that we can never be certain of where it might be sending us or where it will move us and when it will move us to take that first step to following Jesus. But we know that this love is the right answer, even though it's not the answer that our human logic would have come up with. It's the moral equivalent of 8 plus 7 equals 13. And it was enough to send Nicodemus, along with Joseph of Arimathea, to the foot of the cross, to collect the body of Jesus, where he finally understood God's love for the world. He may not have understood why Jesus did it this way, but he couldn't deny the depth of God's love for the world at the foot of the cross. This love is enough for God to pour out his grace on each of us. It's enough to transform us each and every day through the waters of baptism. It's enough to give us hope in God's promise of unending, real, authentic life, even when nothing else adds up. Because it is most certainly true that the cross of Christ is the right answer. For as John says, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Amen.